The Archon quests are some of the most important aspects of Genshin's story, and as a lore channel, I hold them to the highest regard because they are the midpoint between the casual lore players and the hardcore text drivers. The Archon quest is meant to show the main story and lore as coherently and cohesively as it can. It is meant to be a standalone story that everyone can enjoy while still opening room for lore. Now, I have vehemently crucified the last act of Inazuma's Archon quest with a rant video expressing my clear dislike for the method Genshin used to conclude that story. But this time, I'm so glad to say that I'll be having none of that tomfoolery, and instead I'll be discussing why the Sumeru Archon quest part 1 is one of the best stories in Genshin Impact. I'll be discussing my personal thoughts and observations throughout the story, but feel free to disagree or agree with whatever I have to say. After all, this is all just my personal reflections of the Archon quest based on the narrative techniques and just how good it feels, you know? I don't think we've had a story like this in Genshin, and this one really worked wonders. Also, I will be comparing this quest with the old quests because it's important to see how far Genshin's story has improved. To see Genshin's growth, we need to appreciate how far we've come. So yes, I will be making comparisons to further justify some points in this video. Anyway, let's begin. Besides the atmosphere building of Sumeru and the locations and all the aesthetics, the biggest thing that I think makes this story quest great is how everything feels necessary. The introduction of any good story has to be slow and methodical. This is the place you put the building blocks, but you can't just suddenly fight God and expect the players to understand the story. So Genshin takes its time. But it's not like sitting around and doing random fetch quests for strangers to quote-unquote get a better feel of the world. We instead immediately are told of the problems of Sumeru that will be important in the future. We just have to wait and see. And Sumeru's story knows what lore points will tickle our fancy. From the moment we arrive, we are immediately met with the concept of dreams and the important stories of the Aranara and illusions. That Sumeru's people don't dream, and that's considered a good thing, which immediately plants the seeds of doubt into our character. Then, we're hit with the forest's withering, a plot point that connects to future parts of the story but is introduced to us early on so we don't get surprised once it comes up in the future. Then, we get to the knowledge capsule, and the potential of this Scarlet King and Eremite story quest that clearly connects to the future Archon quests. Then we have the Sumeru festival, which I will get to later. But the point is, Sumeru's storytelling is much more condensed, but the duration is much longer than the other Archon quests. It's long, but it doesn't feel pandered out for runtime. We get our core cast of characters, what side of the story they represent, and the potential of how they all connect to the future plot. But given that we're still in the introduction, we need to have an isolated problem to solve so the player doesn't get too panicked. Which brings me to the Sumeru festival, the creme of the crop and the most anticipated part of the first chapter. Most part of my critiques will be on this part of the story quest because this is where the true story of Sumeru begins. Because 2, despite the samsara supposedly being an isolated story arc that has its whole arc conclude within a grander storyline, it just feels complete and necessary. Plus, the story itself is great. Genshin really expanded its show don't tell aspects by integrating player UI into the fray, showing us more emotions of the characters, getting a lot more creative with the cutscene animation despite its limited pool, and really hammering the atmosphere of a dreadful Groundhog Day. The slow exhaustion and panic in Paimon the Traveler's voice is really great. Plus, the solutions that they come up with don't feel cheap. I still remember the absolute shock I felt when the beep went off despite not having the Akasha terminal, and I just went, oh boy. This story just feels so fresh and really hammers in that Inception vibe it needed. It took its time making us feel like we're going through a loop with the Traveler, and showing us what happens with the actions that the Traveler and Paimon take throughout the story. The little changes in how they act, but also the dread that everything is looping back despite everything they're trying to do to fix it. It's great! Honestly, it's great. It's a great and fantastic story that's technically a side story all things considered. The ending of this story was really satisfying and really just paints the scene for the Sumeru Academia, the Akasha, and the potential involvement of other forces outside of Nahida's control. I love it. I genuinely love it. The story was built up and it delivered. It took its time and it did what it needed to do. I referenced the 5-structure act formula when I crucified the Inazuma 3rd arc as being one of the most important methods of storytelling. Given how an Archon quest is supposed to be a standalone story, this is why the Inazuma Archon quest was heavily seen as rushed or unpolished, because it had too many plot points that were skimmed over and didn't follow the 5-structure arc. Contrastingly, Sumeru's Act 1 doesn't have that. It respected the Chekhov's gun principle, a dramatic principle that states that every element in the story must be necessary. The concept of illusions that we saw in the forest, the idea of knowledge capsules, and the importance of Sumeru's people not dreaming. So let's move on to the third point, the characters. Honestly, there's no real character arc that happened in this story. No development of a character's ideals besides the casual talk of believing in yourself or not wanting to bend to fear. But I do have to admit that the characters never went through a mind-boggling change of heart, which really isn't a bad thing. Genshin's characters aren't exactly known for developing within a story, with the exception of a very few. The best character that I think I will point out for this story is Dunyarzad. While the playable characters are great and all, Dunyarzad being a solid character was crucial for this story to work. Even the Traveler and Paimon say it, that one of the reasons they're holding on was because of Dunyarzad. I think that being an NPC, she really didn't have a lot of time to flesh out her character. Which is fine. Genshin is known for its constant rotation of characters in a short amount of time, but I liked how exhausted and tired Dunyarzad became after each cycle. It was, in a way, heartbreaking to see. They did a really good job of that. Granted, it is kind of hand-fisted in a not-so-subtle way to care for Dunyarzad, especially when half of the dialogue is basically patronizing the player into caring for her. I still think her slow descent was done well. Plus, the conclusion that she was alive, but never really cured of her disease, just means that she's still on a timer that was initially set out for her, which is really sad. The playable characters took a bit of a backseat here with the exception of Dea and Nahida, and maybe Kolei, which is fine. The playable characters aren't always meant to be front and center because they have their own story quests. Also, let's talk about Nahida. I like Nahida's writing. Though she did serve to be more of a plot tool than a character, being honest, that's not really a bad thing given we met her and entire cities in a crisis. Her dialogue gets the job done. But you get that underlying sense of responsibility that she has to prove herself as the Dendro Archon. You can see how hard she's working for the Traveler with what little freedom she has to tell them the real story. But what I like about Nahida's dialogue is that they justify moments when she says she can't help you instead of just letting the Traveler accept that. Her justification is that she can't plunge the Traveler with all the answers, in fear that she'll trigger existential dread. Plus, her slow sadness and exasperation when the Traveler repeats answers they've given in previous iterations just make interactions with her a bit more spicier. Now, my next point is something that I appreciated when uncovering the mystery here. I remember before that my biggest gripe with Genshin's storytelling was that it tries to build mystery, but force-feeds information to the player. This was my biggest criticism of a story quest like Kazuha, where Kazuha essentially force-fed the information to the player instead of building it up. Luckily, this quest didn't have that. It takes its time playing with the hypotheses of the Traveler, like testing the relationship of going out of Sumeru, what if we tell the people that they're in a dream, what happens when you try to break people out of the samsara without them having dendro, etc. I think what they are doing was a really clever way of showing what happens when a Traveler does this and results to this. Now, last but certainly not the least is the ending. The ending of a story is always the one that sticks with the player, because the destination in Genshin is as important as the journey, especially for a mystery thriller like this. The ending of this quest for me wasn't necessarily abrupt, but it just felt fine. Nilou being the host of the dream wasn't exactly particularly daunting, given how much of a background character Nilou was in the story, so I didn't really mind it. What I did like is that the ending didn't need to be grand or mind-breaking because this is part 1 of the full story, meaning Genshin is most likely saving the reality bending for future patches. The ending cutscene was beautiful, we got a lot of open ends that give way for the next patches, and we got a lot of lore dump that will keep us on our toes. Overall, the stage has been set extremely well. All of the main themes of dreams, knowledge, wisdom, and mania are laid out, the Withering and the Scarlet King are also laid out for future use, and we have so much to look forward to. I think what I love the most about this quest is that this is just the beginning, and we've already got a really banger introduction. I do love the smaller moments in the scene, like the Traveler's development in the story, and their voice dialogue was absolutely pleasant. And that one moment with Paimon crying into the Traveler's arms was absolutely heartbreaking. So yeah, for me, Act 1 of the Sumeru Archon Quest was fantastic. But what are your thoughts on the Sumeru Archon Quest Part 1? I've seen some people criticize it, some people praise it, so while I liked it, I would love to hear other people's opinions on this because some people may not like the length or the plot feels generic, etc, etc. Anyway, my name is Aster and thank you for chilling with me. Also, click the link down below for 10% off if you're in Gamer Fuel and Gamer Subs. I'm gonna go do that Aranara quest real quick. If I don't come back, just assume that something took me.